Good afternoon, everybody. There is nothing like a full house. My name is Norman Goda. I am the director of the Bud Shorstein Center for Jewish Studies here at the University of Florida, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here today, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here virtually. We'll be moving you to YouTube in one moment. We had a couple of technical problems that we had to work through. I wanted to point out before we start today's program on Jews in the Red Army with Oleg Budnitsky that the Center for Jewish Studies has a number of wonderful events coming up, including a terrific art exhibition from Israel, which will open at Hillel on February 18th and will be there for several days, including our 14th annual Jewish Film Festival, the bulk of which will be in March. I urge you to go to our website, jst.ufl, get on our mailing list, keep yourselves up to date. We have a lot of wonderful things happening. I also want to thank a number of people for sponsoring today's event. I want to thank Natalia Alexion, the Harry Rich Chair, for sponsoring. Natalia, if you're out there and you can hear me, thank you very much. I want to thank Lenka Bustikova from the Center for European History for co-sponsoring. And I would also like to thank Rebecca Jefferson and the Price Judaica Library for co-sponsoring and letting us use this wonderful space. My job is actually to introduce the introducer, and so my final thank you is for my colleague Seth Bernstein, a Soviet historian here at the University of Florida, who put this event together. Thank you, and who will introduce today's speaker. Seth?
Well, it's a huge pleasure to introduce someone who I think if we were in Moscow, this person would not need any introduction. I could just give it, stop right here. Oleg Budnitsky is a renowned historian of the Soviet Union, pre-Soviet Russia, of the civil. Should I turn this up? Yeah. Whoa. All right. Better? Whoa. Oh, all right. Of pre-Soviet Russia, of the Civil War and the Revolution, of World War II in Russia, basically the whole modern period in Russian and Soviet history. He was, from 2011 to 2023, the founding director of the International Center for the History and Sociology of World War II and its Consequences, or as it was known affectionately in Russia, the World War II Center at the Higher School of Economics, one of the major research universities in Russia. He was also professor, and I believe still is professor of history there. Currently, he is a research fellow at the Dorothy and Lewis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at NYPL, the New York Public Library. And last year, he was at the National Research Center, National Humanities Research Center in the Research Triangle. He's the author or editor or co-author of, co-author of 9 books. I have a few of them here in Russian. And the co-editor of 27 volumes. They span Imperial Russia, so the history of terror I could pull out, although no one knows Russian here, so it doesn't matter. It could be about anything. The history of the war and the history of the revolution. I think the thing he's known best for in the United States is probably his book, Russian Jews Between the Reds and the Whites, which, there we go, with the lovely and evocative cover there that came out with University of Pennsylvania Press in 2012. And I would be amiss to not mention that he's a renowned public historian as well. So if you know him in Russia, the chances are that you probably from TV or from the radio. I know that my in-laws, he's basically the only colleague that they know because they've seen him on TV. So without further ado, I want to invite Oleg up here, Oleg Vitalich, to talk to us about Jews in the Red Army during the World War II. Oleg.
Thank you, Seth, for the introduction, and Seth, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. It's and what? How collaborate with them? Just click. Okay. Okay. So, to start with a little bit water. Well, and today I will speak about the using the red army during World War II, which was a kind of mystery. I mean, but why mystery? Because there was no statistics, there was no official data. It was classified during the Soviet period and during the post-Soviet period. Only several years ago, this information was declassified. So today, for the first time, we have some more or less scholarly basis for discussing this issue. And but I would like to start with the earlier period because, to my understanding, not many people here in the United States actually, I would say, understood correctly Soviet Jewish history. Everybody here, of course, heard, of course, about black years of Soviet Jews, about Dr. Splot, about anti-cosmopolitan campaign, about persecution of Jews, and so on and so forth. But there was some, other times. In 1931, the satirical novel *The Golden Calf* by Soviet writers Ilya Ilf and Evgeny Petrov was published. It is one of the most popular works written in Russian in the 20th century, and among other things contains the most famous witty remark of the situation of Jews in the USSR. The book features a dialogue between two fictional characters, American journalist Hiram Berman and Soviet journalist Polomidov. The Golden Calf was 3 times translated into English. 3 different translations, the first time the next year after his publication in Russian. There is there is a quotation from this novel. Hiram Berman, a Zionist, was interested principally in the Jewish question in the Soviet Union. He asked Polomidov about that. But we have no such problem, said Polomidov. What do you mean there is no Jewish problem? Hiram asked in astonishment. There isn't. It does not exist. Mr. Berman became excited. All his life, he had written articles for the newspapers about the Jewish problem. And to part with this problem was very painful. But aren't there Jews in Russia? He asked cautiously. There are, Polomidov answered. That is not there also the problem? No, there are Jews, but there is no problem. It is possible that this line was an ironic commentary on the massive campaign against anti-Semitism, which the Soviet state was carrying out when the novel was written. Still, from the authorities' point of view, there was little if any difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Sovietism. When the novel was published in 1931, ethnically Jewish officials were at the head of the People's Commissariat of Agriculture, Transport, Foreign Trade, and Foreign Affairs, as well as the State Bank and Soviet Cinema. A Jew was the first secretary of the Moscow Committee of the Communist Party, that is the master of the capital. The chief commissar of the Red Army, head of the Red Army Political Directorate, and editor-in-chief of the central newspaper of the Communist Party, Pravda, The Truth, were also Jewish. 10 years later, on the eve of the war, there were 6 Jews in the Soviet government, the Council of People's Commissars, including 3 deputy chairmen and the People's Commissars of Transport, State Control, Armament, Construction, and Navy. Historian Benjamin Pincus had a point when he compared the role of Jews in the Soviet Union with the role of Germans in Imperial Russia. Before the war, Jews were the most successful of all the Soviet ethnicities, the most urbanized, the most educated, and the most Soviet. However, as the not too distant future showed, some contemporaries who seriously believed that the Jewish question had been solved in the Soviet Union forever were very naive people. The beginning of war was marked an outbreak of anti-Semitism, which spread not only in the occupied territories, but also in the Soviet area and in the Red Army. My task does not include analyzing the phenomenon as a whole. I will only highlight one aspect that has influenced historiography: the accusation of Jews that they were avoiding military service by staying in the area and using various means to evade army duty. Let me remind you that there were about 3 million Jews living in the Soviet Union within the borders of September the 1st, 1939, before partition of Poland. It comprised 1.78% of the total population of the USSR, less than 2%. Jews were the 7th most populous people in the Soviet Union after Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Uzbeks, Tatars, and Kazakhs. The history of Jews in the Red Army is an inseparable part of the history of Soviet Jewry. Nevertheless, knowledge about Jewish participation in the Red Army remained for a long time limited. The national composition of the Red Army was classified. Therefore, until recently, the extensive historiography of the role of the Jews in the World War II based its estimates of the number of Jews in the Red Army, their distribution among the various branches of the army, and the proportion of soldiers and officers among them on demographic statistics, common sense, and fragmentary evidence. The reason for the secrecy of the data on the national composition of the Red Army had nothing to do with the Jews. One of the most enduring Soviet and post-Soviet myths about the war was that one of the most important sources of victory was the friendship and brotherhood of the peoples of the Soviet Union. As declassified data show, in October 1943, the peoples of Central Asia and Transcaucasia were exempt from conscription or drafted into the army and then sent to the labor front. The reason was the lack of knowledge of the Russian language and low motivation of the conscripts. Could you imagine these people who never been in European part of the Soviet Union, who did not know Russian, and who were delivered to this unknown area for them, and they were told, you know what, it's your motherland, son, and you should die for this state. Therefore, when the liberation of the territories of Ukraine and Belarus and accordingly the conscription of Slavic population began, the military command and political leadership decided to get rid of the unreliable contingent. Eventually, the number of peoples of the Soviet Union fully or partially exempt from conscription exceeded 40. Ultimately, the Soviet authorities came to the same principle of mobilization as the authorities of Imperial Russia. This partly explains why Jews, the 7th largest ethnic group among the peoples of the USSR, ranked 5th in the composition of the Red Army after 3 Slavic peoples and the Tatars. A few words about the rather extensive historiography of Jewish participation in the Red Army during the Second World War. A significant part of which is of amateur or semi-amateur nature. I do not have the opportunity again to analyze it in detail. In my opinion, it represents a kind of a hybrid of the Soviet heroic narrative with lachrymose historiography, to paraphrase Sela Baron's expression. The titles of some publications are characteristic: Encyclopedia of Jewish Heroism, Essays on Jewish Heroism in 3 volumes, and the like. It is proudly reported that Jews ranked 4th in the numbers of those awarded orders and medals during the war. More than 230,000 Jews were awarded with orders and medals during the war. At the same time, it is reported that in 1943, head of main political directorate of the Red Army, Alexander Sherbakov, issued an order reading, "Medals for distinguished conduct are to be awarded of all nations, but within limits with regard to the Jews." How one combines with the other is not explained. According to Israeli historian Arkady Zeltser, with my friend, due to the lack of relevant statistical information, it is difficult to arrive at qualitative conclusions relating to the ethnicity of the Red Army personnel during the Soviet-German War. The estimated number of Jews in the army, which ranged from 300,000 to 500,000, is based either on the percentage of Jews in the total pre-war Soviet population or on data related to the end of the war. It is even more difficult to determine the level of participation of Jews in combat. The sole relevant data published in the USSR in 1975 related to the ethnic composition of 200 infantry divisions. In January 1943, Jews comprised 1.5% of this group. In other words, their proportion was lower than 178 proportion of Jews in the USSR in the 1939 census. Actually, what historians discuss on this issue is absolutely nonsensical. First, it is not possible in any country, to draft, to mobilize all men of certain age. First, of medical reasons. Second, of social. Some of them were imprisoned. Some of them were, busy with industry. And in reality, in Soviet Union, about 80% of men, the state was able to mobilize. Moreover, if we are speaking about Jews, about 30% of Soviet Jews who lived here before partition of Poland were exterminated during the Holocaust by Nazi collaborators in 1941, 1942 mostly. So, to my calculation, the percentage of Jews in the Red Army should be about 1% only. Now, let's go to the statistic, which was revealed several years ago when these materials were declassified. The most important document is special reports, which was prepared by General Staff to the Soviet leadership and printed in one copy. It's a summary of the Red Army personnel on socio-demographic factors, including nationality. Let's look at some, it's a continuation of quotation from this outstanding novel, but we experience again something, something with technology. It's look at this title of this declassified document of the list of the Red Army personnel by socio-demographic characteristic, July the 1st, 1942. Actually, these albums were prepared every 6 months. Every 6 months, the next, it's January the 1st, 1945. We have all these albums except one, during the war period, except January the 1st, 1942, because there was a complete chaos at that period of time, and it was not just possible to calculate anything. How this looks like? I understand that majority of you do not know Russian, and I would like to explain. This row, it's ethnicities. 36 ethnicities were recorded, from Russians to, for some reason, Chinese. I don't know why Chinese. Germans, by the way, also calculated as a Soviet nation. This 14th row, Jews. And this is branches of the army. Infantry, cavalry, tanks, and so on and so forth. A lot of them. And for each branch, we have the exact number of personnel of this or that nationality, ethnicity. And there is no surprise that the most Jews, not most, but the biggest share of Jews served in the infantry, because it was the biggest branch of the Red Army. Then followed tanks and some other combat units, but the Jews served in every branch of the Red Army, including cavalry, as an example. And what is interesting, if we are speaking about the sources, in addition to statistics, about the position of Jews in the Red Army, during the war, there was established a special commission for the history of Academy of Sciences for the history of Great Patriotic War, so-called Minsk Commission. Head of this commission was a Soviet historian, Isaac Mintz. And they recorded interviews with servicemen. During the war, they recorded about 4,000 interviews. These interviews also were, classified for decades. Now they are available. I had a chance to look through and to study all these interviews, and I identified among them 300 interviews with Jews from various levels, from commander of the army, general, up to hairdresser of Kuban Cossack Cavalry Corps. That was especially amazing. Next. There is the other list, and we have here a distribution by various fronts and the armies. This is a summary, how many actually Jews served in this or that period of time in the Red Army, both in absolute numbers and in percentage. This is, again, various fronts. This is officers by nationality. That is especially interesting point. Look here, Jews, enormous number of officers, 84,500, which comprise 5.3% of the total officers' corps of the Red Army, which is unusual. Then let's step a bit back and look at the representation of the Jews in the Red Army before the war. It's 6 months before the war. This is a relative number of Red Army personnel by nationalities, and what we see are Jews substantially, especially officers, exceed the share of the population, number of share of the population. One more important point. Students of military academies. This is senior officers. It's Academy of General Staff, it's senior officers, starting from major and up. And considerable number among cadets of military schools and courses. Speaking on the absolute numbers, I mean how many officers served in the Red Army at that time. There were 18,300 officers in the ranks, nearly 2,000 in the military academies, and more than 7,000 in military schools. It was a basis for the, let's say, expansion of Jews in the military. Then, what we see, that is we see how many Jews served in the Red Army on each date, and what is proportional share of Jews in the army. And that is really sensational. As I told before, to any logical calculations, there should be about 1% or less Jews in the army. Instead, in the whole period of war, its relative share of the Jews in the army exceeds, their share in the pre-war population. How this phenomenon could be explained? As I mentioned, there is enormous number of officers among Jewish servicemen. It's started in 1942 from about 36%. At the end of the war, it was about 43%. Nearly half of all Jewish servicemen were officers. What follows from here? It means the Jewish losses during the war, at least in 1943, 1945, were less than average. Less than average because officers had less chances to be killed or wounded than privates. And statistics also shows us that among wounded, the share of Jews is lower average. That is good news, actually. Good news, but in reality we can't say if less Jews perished than expected, because in 1941, 1944, the Red Army, lost a lot of people, and about 4 million soldiers were captured by Germans. In this situation, unfortunately, Jews had no chance to survive. Or better to say, the chance was 0.3%. During the war and after the war, more than 1.5 million prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war, were returned back, were liberated by the Red Army. Jews among them were about 4,000 who mysteriously survived. So less than 1%. So we do not know how many Jews actually perished during the war. Soviet, or not Soviet, Russian General Staff, when the Soviet losses were declassified, it happened only in post-Soviet period in 1993, and they published an approximate number of people of various nationality perished during the war. But it was not real statistics. There was no statistic, killed by nationality, and it's estimate. Estimate, having in mind percentage of in the army. So Jews, according to General Staff, 142,000 Jews were killed. But again, it's not real figure. We just do not know. Maybe less, maybe more. In the second half of war, evidently less. In the first half, we don't know. And again, about a number of Jews in the Red Army. How many Jews finally served in the Red Army? As I mentioned before, estimates from 300,000 to 500,000. Again, we don't know. We know how many Jews served in the Red Army on certain data, at certain date, but we do not know how many of them were killed before or were sent home because of they were wounded or for some other reasons. To my calculations, to my estimate, it's closer, it's something between 300,000, but no more than 400. Actually, perhaps because perhaps this number a bit higher, because a lot of Jewish women served in the army. They were more educated than others, and a lot of them volunteered. Again, we do not know the exact number, but what I see in the documents, there were pretty many Jewish women in the Red Army. The total number of women in the Red Army was about 500,000. It was the biggest army, by the way, in the world's history. During the war in the Red Army served 34 million men and 500,000 women. About 9 million perished during the war. Then officers' corps in the Red Army by nationalities. You see what happened with this phenomenon. Jews started the war with this number, 3.57%, and then the share of Jews increased by 50%. And the number of Jewish officers the share of Jewish officers exceed Belarusians. Only 2 times exceed Belarusians. That was really a phenomenon, and according to one Russian military historian, as we see that Russians, three Slavic peoples and Jews, comprised more than 90% of all officers in the Red Army. So it was kind of monopoly, according to this historian, one of the military historian represent of General Staff. In absolute numbers, the number of Jewish officers during the war continuously increased. Accordingly, the proportion of officers among Jewish servicemen also continuously grew. And if we are speaking about absolute numbers, there were more than 68 Jewish officers in the Red Army in 1944. And it reached an enormous number, as I showed already, nearly 90,000. The share of Jews among senior officers was even higher. You see the absolute numbers and relative. Senior officers, it's from major to colonel. In absolute numbers, and in absolute numbers, Jews 2 times exceed number of Belarusians, as an example, and only 2 times less than Ukrainians, which substantially exceed number of Jews. On May 1944, there were about 3,000 generals in the Red Army, without Navy, NKVD, NKGB, and other people's commissariats. Out of this number, there were 102 Jewish generals. It was more than in all other armies in the world together. To the end of the war, there were about 150 Jewish generals in the Red Army. But if we will take into account Jews in NKVD, there were 21 generals, by the way, of the Jewish NKVD to the end of the war. In admirals in Navy and those who served in general staff and in the People's Commissariat of Defense. So the number of Jewish generals exceed 200, about 220. This was also a phenomenon. Due to time limitation, I, skipping a lot of statistical information because I would like, in addition to that, to show you some persons who are beyond figures, beyond statistics, right? That's why I skip a lot of information, but again, I would like to go back. Okay, this is no, not. I mean, no. Yeah. Okay. I just again to stress this. I would say really sensational character of this number of figures, especially having in mind those people who were promoted to the rank of senior officers. This is the top Jewish serviceman in the Red Army during the war. It's actually Chief Commissar of the Red Army. I mentioned him already, Leo Mechlis, Chief of the main political directorate of the Red Army. Stalin appointed him to this position June 21st, 1941, the last day before German attack the Soviet Union. So he wanted to have some reliable person on this position. And he was really reliable, and what distinguished Leo Mechlis, absolutely bravery, cruelty, and absolute incompetence in military affairs. And by the way, he was a former member of Коалицион party before revolution. And for any other Soviet Jew or not Jew who was member of some petty bourgeois party, it would be disaster. But not for those people chosen by Stalin. So Mechlis survived everything, and I mentioned on our meeting today in the day that Mechlis, who died several months before his master, was buried. It was in February 1953. It's period of Doctor's Plot and anti-Semitic campaign in the Soviet Union. Leo Mechlis was buried in the Kremlin wall, the most prestigious cemetery in the Soviet Union, in the Red Square. And he is still here with other Stalin's executioners. Mechlis was appointed to supervise supposed Red Army advance in the Crimea in 1942. And it was disaster, both for the Red Army and for Mechlis. But the major disaster was that Red Army troops in the Crimea was poorly trained, and they had such strong rival as General Erich von Manstein, one of the best German generals who commanded German Wehrmacht troops in Crimea. And that was ended up in disaster. But what I would like to mention, in the Bagirov trench near Kerch, the Soviet army discovered the first evidence of the Holocaust on the liberated territory. The bodies of 7,000 Jews who had been shot by the Nazis. Mechlis was so shocked by the sight that he issued an order which had no precedence in the history of the Red Army. I quote, "In Kerch, there is up to 7,000 bodies of civilians, including children, all shot by the fascist monsters. The blood turns cold from the fury and desire for vengeance. I order to finish off the fascist prisoners." End of quote. The order did not mention the fact that the victims were Jewish. They were, civilians, peaceful Soviet citizens. As I mentioned already, the Crimea campaign was a disaster to the Red Army. In 12 days, 250,000 strong Red Army suffered 176 casualties in Crimea. Mechlis telegrammed Stalin, "We have brought shame to our country and we must be cursed." To any other person, the end would be easily predictable, but Mechlis was just demoted from the general of the army to the rank of general lieutenant. He continued to serve as a special representative of Stalin in the front lines up to the end of the war. Then he was, promoted again to colonel general and appointed again as a minister of the state control of the Soviet Union. That was his last position. This is Mechlis in Crimea. And this is quite unusual, right, for Soviet general image. General Yakov Kreiser is a major Jewish military hero of this war. In 1941, his division delayed German advance for 2 days. That was a great distinction in that period of time. Finally, his division was destroyed. Kreiser was wounded, evacuated to Moscow, and he was promoted from colonel to general. and was awarded the Order of Hero of Soviet Union, the first senior officer in the Red Army. And this photograph was taken in the Crimea in 1944. At that period of time, Kreiser was commander of the army, not on division. And his army retook Sevastopol, the most important city in Crimea, in 2 days. In 2 days, and he ended up the war in the rank of Colonel General and in Germany. Naturally, he was a member of Presidium of Soviet anti-Jewish, anti-fascist committee. But when all the members of economic committee leadership was arrested and executed later, Kreiser survived. This is just one of. I assume that it's time for me to finish. Yeah, but I just would like to show you some other images of not rank and file, but some junior officers. It's Senior Lieutenant Cyril Tsir. I show you people who interviews with whom were recorded, and it's very interesting stories, recorded not 40 or 50 years after the war, but exactly at that time. And they sometimes told incredible stories, like Tsir, who after the capture of Melitopol said that they were very dissatisfied with attitudes of local population, and they suspected that some group of women hide Germans and help them to survive. And what they did, they shot these women on the spot. And it, talked about that. It was more or less ordinary thing. He was awarded several. He was political commissar, but he distinguished and received his orders not for propaganda work, but because he was distinguished himself in a battle. This is Shakhovich family in Starokonstantinov in Ukraine. There is Moisei Shakhovich before his conscription to the Red Army. All his family were killed by Nazis during the Holocaust. He found out that only liberation of Starokonstantinov. This is Captain Moisei Shakhovich. He was commander of artillery battery. Artillery battery, and Shakhovich on October 1943, during the battle for Melitopol, I mentioned already the city, when the commander of the Penal Company was wounded, Shakhovich assumed command. Harsh fighting began to the city park. A German machine gun halted the Soviet advance. Shakhovich managed to approach it unnoticed. He took a moment when the machine gunner was changing the magazine and cut off his head with a saber spade. For that, he was awarded, title of the Hero of the Soviet Union. Interesting person, and after the war, he lived in Baku, and he was also awarded he was appointed at the position of director of supermarket. Because there was a shortage of everything in the Soviet Union, especially food, he became, very important and famous person in Baku. And up to nowadays, this central supermarket in Baku called supermarket by Uncle Misha, because he was known not as Moisei, but as Mikhail. And it's autopsy of it's command of Soviet experts at the burned body of Joseph Goebbels, the chief German propagandist. This is the only woman among them. It's Anna Marantz. She made autopsy of Hitler. She was Jewish from Kiev. This is and she opened Hitler's body. It was an irony of the history. So much effort, Hitler spent for extermination Jewish people, and finally the Jewish lady opened his body. This is a scheme of Hitler's teeth, and she, discovered that his teeth are intact, more or less, and that's why this burned body was identified. And this lady, military translator Elena Kagan, better known as Elena Rzhevskaya, as his literary name, she kept Hitler's body in the box under her arm for at least a couple of days. They did not have a safe at hand, so she was keeper, and she was afraid during decades because it was a top secret somehow. Stalin, for unknown reason, preferred to keep Soviet people, unknown about that Hitler was committed suicide, that he is dead. And it's she with her comrades. It's Brandenburg Gate in Berlin in May 1945. And now I'm going to conclusion. During the war, Jews remained an important part of the Soviet system, and their role in the army increased significantly. The share of officers among Jewish servicemen was between 40 and 50%, and the number of mid-ranks and the senior officers were constantly growing. This casts doubt on the widespread notion in historiography that the Soviet rulers discriminated against the Jews in the military. The literature frequently mentions the order on the limitation of awards to Jews, and that head of the main political directorate of the Red Army, Alexander Sherbakov, allegedly issued in the beginning of 1943. However, the number of medals and orders awarded to Jews had increased by the end of the war up to 34 times more than in January 1943. The order allegedly issued by Sherbakov has not been located, and neither has any other document restricting Jewish servicemen in any way during the war. The common patterns among Jewish officers are striking. Most of them were born to poor families in the Pale of Settlement. They owed their education and their careers to the Soviet system. Those who were senior or top officers laid the foundation of their careers in the 1920s, 1930s. They climbed all ranks of the military ladder and received specialized or higher military education. They belonged to the first Soviet generation. They were mobile, and they had drifted away from Jewish traditions. Almost all of them were Komsomol or Communist Party members, which was a prerequisite of a successful career, especially in the military. This was a transitional generation. Many of them had been recorded in the documents by their Jewish names. And hardly anyone from Jewish families from the former Pale of Settlement did not know Yiddish or was not familiar with Jewish traditions. However, with rare exceptions, they did not discuss Jewish themes in their interviews, which were recorded during the war. Kirill Lutov, the protagonist of Isaac Babel's Red Cavalry, and its author's alter ego, implored fate to grant him, I quote, the simplest of proficiencies, the ability to kill a man. The skill of killing Nazis was hardly simple. The Red Army was facing the best army in the world. The Soviet New Jews mastered the skill professionally. This was crucial as the survival of all Jews, whether old, new, Shabbat observant or not, attending synagogues or Communist Party meetings, depended on it. As for the history of Soviet Jews, it still remains to be written. Thank you.
Thank you, Oleg. And I think you really showed the importance of Jews in the Red Army, and not only as a numerical sense, but also playing these huge roles in really important and interesting areas. Who knew? So we can open up the floor for questions. I don't know how much time we have.
Thank you for coming to Gainesville. We appreciate it. Question: all these Jewish Soviet Army personnel that were captured and killed by the Germans, how did the Germans find out they were Jewish?
So how did the Germans know that Army personnel were Jewish?
In the majority of cases, they were betrayed by their comrades. Betrayed. There are other, you know, that there was still some Jewish traditions. So it was, you know, at that time, it was not so difficult to identify Jews. I mean, circumcision, yeah.
In the oral testimonies of women Jewish survivors who were saved by the Russians coming through, they are very often talk about the Jewish soldier or the Jewish officer who came to them, and then they felt safe and protected. So I was wondering if that was true, because it happens I mean, you see it a lot in the testimonies, but there's all this writing about rape after the war, and here are these Jewish women, and they feel safe because there's a Jewish Russian soldier. So is that true? Do you know?
The honest answer is I don't know. Because, there were rapes, and there was those soldiers who protected, you know, women. Jewish and non-Jewish, it depends. But again, when we, you know, dealt with oral history, it's the least reliable source to my understanding as historian. And what is important is these interviews recorded during the war. These people, you know, the official canon of the history of war was still in the making. So they just did not know what is allowed and what is not. And sometimes they, you know, spoke very openly, and it just could not imagine if they would spoke in the same way after the war or in our times. So, in these interviews, and especially in soldiers' diaries, it is possible to find incredible information about both saving somebody or raping somebody. And one, by the way, I published this his diary without any exceptions. One Jewish officer, Vladimir Gelfand, he raped German woman, and he, described it very openly in some very, I would say, unpleasant details. Well, and it was diary for his own use, but somehow he kept it, and finally it was published. After that, he had some more pragmatic relations with a number of German women, and it's the other story. It was not violence, let's say. It was voluntarily. It was very easy to exchange food for sex in post-war Germany.
I'm going to use the chair's prerogative first. So we've had all these statistics about how Jews made up a disproportionate amount of the army, especially of officers in the army, especially of higher level officers in the army. And I wonder what it must have been like to command a bunch of Russians, mostly, right? Russians and Ukrainians, disproportionately as privates in the army. What that must have been like for a Jewish person to be a commander of them. Was it hard for them? Do they leave records about anti-Semitism from below? Were they treated the same from above and from below? I'm sure that's might be on the minds of people here, is the actual experience of commanding as a Jewish officer or living as a Jewish private.
Thank you. Actually, dependent on of performance. And it depended on personality. It depended on various circumstances. And in one diary, as an example, this Gelfand, I mentioned him, right? He constantly complained for anti-Semitism, and that even soldiers, treated him not good, let's say, the least. The other, his name Boris Suris, military translator, and he recorded in his diary, "Oh, everybody loves me. Everybody." And it was so. He was very popular. He was always in good mood, and he was, personality on some, commander. One from interview with some commander of brigade in the period of defense of Sevastopol in 1944. He just ordered commanders of battalions to retake something on the German controlled territory, and he promised just to shoot all of them if they would not do that. They did. 2 out of 3 were killed in action. So that was style of the command of some officers, irrespective Jewish or non-Jewish. Actually, in the sources, there are the other kind of sources. I worked a lot with protocols of military tribunals. There are some anti-Semitic manifestations in the army, but I'm not sure that it was always, but frequently they were severely punished. But on one a bit funny statement of one of the convicts, she claimed that, I quote, "I did not know that it's prohibited to call a political officer a kike." Что запрещено называть политрука жидом. And but he was the initial stages of the war, there were a lot of executions in the Red Army due to low discipline, desertion, and many other, military crimes, let's say. From the beginning of war, June 1941 to the beginning of October, more than 10,000 Soviet soldiers were executed by military tribunals. 3,000 of them publicly. To the end of the war, 100,000 and 135,000 soldiers were shot for various crimes. In general, more than 1 million Soviet soldiers were, convicted for various crimes during the war, and a considerable part of them were executed, as I mentioned. It was very cruel war. It was enormous army, and the people who served in the Red Army were various kinds. Not of them were actually criminals. It was some kind of punishment to show others what should be correct behavior, what would be if they would behave themselves not a right way. Sometimes for just some criticism towards Soviet system, and so on and so forth. But a considerable part of them were really criminals, and they were, executed or sent to camps, or very often they were sentenced, let's say, to the 10 years in a camp, but instead of that were sent to the front. So again, it's, to my understanding, it's still untold story, because for decades all these materials were classified, and even now they are declassifying very slowly.
Hi. You spoke about how there were many Jewish officers disproportionately in the Red Army. I'm wondering, could the nature of the German enemy being anti-Semitic and, persecuting the Holocaust, could that have caused Jewish Soviet citizens to kind of be emboldened and have further motivation to excel in the army and become officers and, try to defeat the Germans?
No. It's, well, first, many of them were career officers. They served in the army before the war, before the Holocaust. It's, I mentioned that if we take into account officers in the ranks, and those who were students of military academies or military schools, it's already about 20,000 people. Many specialists, doctors, engineers, translators, and so on, were mobilized in the army. As a rule, they have higher education, so they were promoted to the officer ranks, and so on and so forth. And actually, many Jews just did not know anything about what later will be called the Holocaust. There was no, it was not, there was some publication, but very limited. It was not widespread, available information. And they discovered what happened to their families when this territory, were liberated. So I do not see that that was the major motivation. For some of them, yes, but for the majority, no.